Today, we are going to talk about how conflict is such a huge part of a plot. The role it plays, how to determine the main conflict, and how to then use that conflict to help you decide who is the antagonist in a story. Conflict is the problem in a story that must be solved. It's an issue between the protagonist or the main character and the antagonist forces, or whatever or whoever is against the main character or is causing the problem. It forms the basis of the plot. Without conflict, you do not have a story. Now, what are our types of conflict? We have external conflict, in which the main character has to confront or go against something outside themselves. Character versus character, where the protagonist must defeat or at least confront another character. We have character versus nature, where your protagonist is in danger because of a natural force, whether it's a bear or a hurricane or just surviving in the wilderness. We also have character versus society. This is the basis of a lot of dystopian stories where you have the protagonist who is being oppressed or has to fight injustice based on the rules of a society or the laws or the structure. Character versus supernatural, that's when you have an evil wizard, say, or ghosts, or gods and goddesses. And then character versus technology, robots, um, computers. Anytime a character has to go against a technological force that is causing problems. These are all external conflict sources. There is only one type of internal conflict, and that is character versus self. That is when the character struggles internally with their own feelings, emotions, thoughts, fears, where they have to struggle inwardly about a decision or a weakness or something like that. Now, how do all of these things play into plot? Well, let's talk about that. You're familiar with a plot map. We've done this a whole lot. You have the setting, you have exposition, which includes important background information, and honestly, setting is usually part of exposition. Then you have an initiating event that gets the story started. Rising action, the events happen and keep happening until you get to the climax, the big event in the story, the part where the main character must face the conflict once and for all. After that, falling action happens very quickly. The big confrontation happens. This is where the everything kind of falls, literally falling action. Everything falls into place until there's resolution. Resolution is where the main character faces the consequences, good or bad, of this big showdown in the climax. This is where the character either enjoys the fact that the problem's solved, learns to live with the problem because it couldn't get resolved, or faces the agony of defeat. The resolution is basically where the consequences show up. This is where they learn to live with whatever happened. Now, how does knowing the type of conflict help you figure all this out? Well, the challenge is there are lots of different conflicts in each story, but every story has a main conflict and often minor conflicts in addition. How do you find the main conflict? One good place to start is this initiating event. What happens to get the story started? In, say, let's say Finding Nemo. In Finding Nemo, what happens that gives us real action? It's when Nemo gets kidnapped, when Nemo gets taken from the water. So if Nemo is taken from the water and that starts the story and that's what gives us the story, then what kind of conflict is that? That's going to be character versus character, or man versus man on this particular visual, but character versus character, because it's Nemo versus the kidnapper. Eventually, the whole story is about Marlin trying to rescue Nemo from this kidnapper and Nemo trying to escape the fish tank because of the kidnapper. So, if that's the case, the climax, the big event, is when Nemo escapes the tank. So, knowing what your main conflict is helps you figure out some really big parts of your plot map. So, here's a suggestion: figure out your main type of conflict first and fill in the initiating event and the climax, and everything else should fall into place a little more easily. Be aware, again, there are definitely more than one type of conflict in a story. Think about it. In Nemo, you had moments where more character versus character because Marlin versus the sharks. You had Marlin versus himself going through all the insecurities and the fears and am I a good father and giving Nemo his freedom, all of this inner turmoil. But we would not have a story if Nemo had not been kidnapped. So each story has one main conflict, may have several minor ones. To determine the main conflict, identify the big problem that gives us a story in the first place. You do not have a plot without conflict. You do not have a story without a main conflict. So ask yourself, what's giving me a story? And then work backward from there.